This is the Fantasy Football Podcast, where we take data and convert it into fantasy success. No bias, no hot takes, only victory. This is the Fantasy Alchemist Podcast, and now your host, Dustin Chandry. Welcome to episode 17 of the Fantasy Alchemist Podcast. I'm your host, Dustin Chandry. And today I'll be recommending waiver wire targets ahead of week 4 of the fantasy season. Now, this list is going to be a combination of breakout rookies, opportunistic veterans, and players whose metrics indicate a breakout game is on the horizon. As always, you can follow the show on Twitter. Our handle is at FFAlchemistPod, now verified. Again, it's at FFAlchemistPod. You can also email us directly at fantasyalchemistpodcast@gmail.com. Now let's get into the waiver wire targets ahead of week 4. Now, first I want to start with two players who have limited availability in some leagues. These are players who are below 80% ownership right now, but should be well above 90%. So if either one of these players are available in your league, these are the players you need to be prioritizing on your waiver wire. The first is going to be running back Zach Moss of the Indianapolis Colts. He is currently at 78% ownership right now, which is actually the same ownership, according to ESPN, as Cam Akers. Now, Moss should be in your starting lineup, and compared to Cam Akers should really just be off your roster altogether, yet they currently have the same ownership percentage ahead of the Week 3 waivers. Now, as for Moss, in Week 3, he had 30 carries plus 3 targets. He had 122 yards rushing, 23 yards receiving, 2 receptions, and a receiving touchdown. Moss didn't have the 98% snap share that he did last week, but he was still above 75% in Week 3. He is getting elite usage. Zach Moss, you should be starting him every single week as a top 20 running back until Jonathan Taylor returns. And then the other player is rookie tight end for the Detroit Lions. That's Sam Laporta. He is currently at 64% ownership right now, so that means he's still available in a third of ESPN leagues. He had a breakout game here in Week 3, but the indicators were there in Week 1 and 2 that breakout was coming. In Week 3, he had 11 targets on 29 routes run. That's a rate of 39% targets per route run, which is exceptional. Every single week, he's been at least over 75% snap participation. He is second on the team in targets after 3 weeks. His target count per week has gone 5, 6, and then 11 here in Week 3. His fantasy points per week has gone 11.4, 13.8, and 26.4 this week when he breaks out with the 11 targets and he scored the touchdown. Now, there have been 6 instances since the 2021 season where a tight end had a game with a targets per route run rate above 38% and had a minimum of 28 routes run, which is what Laporta just did here in Week 3. There's only 6 tight ends that have done that here in the last 2 years. TJ Hawkinson did it twice last year after he got traded to Minnesota. Mark Andrews has done it twice. George Kittle had 1 game in 2021, and Evan Ingram had 1 game last year with the Jags. Laporta has done it here in his 3rd career game. On top of that, Lions tight end Sam Laporta has 18 career receptions. That's the most for a tight end over the first 3 games I think in the history of the NFL. The next best was 13 receptions. Now, Laporta should be locked in as a top 10 play at the position every single week. And I think he, at this point, even 3 games in, he should be considered a top 5 tight end already in Dynasty. Again, he's available in a third of ESPN leagues. Now let's take a look at players who are going to be more widely available. These are players who typically are going to be below 50% ownership, according to ESPN leagues. So let's start first. 1 quarterback recommendation here for the waiver wire this week, and that is going to be Packers quarterback Jordan Love. And look, the Jordan Love experience truly is something else. This guy has one of the worst completion rates in the league. He was at 50% in Week 3, and in fact, if you take every game this season plus 2 from previous seasons where he played at least 60 snaps, he hasn't been above 60% completion in any of those games. His touchdown to completion rate continues to be well outside league averages, and I would think he's due for regression, but it just hasn't come. He's done this for 3 straight weeks now. His touchdown totals for the first 3 weeks, he has 3, 3, and 2 last week, including a rushing touchdown this week, which is, I mean, that's just a huge plus. And he is consistently scoring between 20 to 25 fantasy points each of the first 3 weeks of the season. Now, look, if you're in the dumps with somebody like Justin Fields or Joe Burrow right now, then, as the Beatles would sing, all you need is love. Jordan Love currently available in 52% of leagues ahead of the Week 4 waiver. There's going to be a lot of running back options on the waiver claim this week, but the biggest and the highest priority is going to be Dolphins running back Devon Achane. Now, look, I loved Achane. He was one of my favorite rookie targets in Dynasty this offseason. However, I would be very cautious about how much FAAB dollars or auction dollars I would be using to try and get him off waivers if that's the type of league you are in. Now, his week 3 numbers are just, it's absurd, right? 18 carries, 203 yards, 2 rushing touchdowns. He caught all 4 targets for 30 receiving yards and 2 receiving touchdowns. He scored 51 fantasy points on only 30 snaps played. Okay, since 2021, all running backs with less than 35 snaps in a game, the highest fantasy scorer in that group was 22 points. Achane had 51 last week. Okay, so the concerning things that I would be looking at, he only had 41% snap participation. That's a little bit alarming. He had a crazy high 36% targets per route run rate. He had 4 targets on only 11 routes run. He had over 11 yards per carry in week 3, which is incredible. But at the same time, it was just him and Raheem Mostert, right? Salvon Ahmed was out with an injury. Jeff Wilson is eligible to return from IR soon. I think the competition for snaps are going to increase, and you can't expect what his week 3 level of explosiveness that he had last week. You'll get that every week going forward. And because of the blowout, the Dolphins ran it at a 3-to-2 ratio compared to passing, which is much higher than their norm. So you're going to see more competition for snaps. There's going to be less weekly rushing opportunities than the blowout we saw in week 3. I think it's unlikely to yield the fantasy production again given his snap volume. I think Achane is going to be the ultimate boom-bust player week to week, which is why I would recommend you not spend big dollars on him from a FAAB standpoint. If you're not in a FAAB league, just put your claim in. If you're lucky enough to grab him, congratulations. But I have another running back who's also at 16% snap share that I think could potentially be due for a breakout here in the coming weeks too, and that is Titans running back Tyjae Spears. Now, Spears has outsnapped Derrick Henry in 2 out of 3 games so far. In week 1, Spears had a slightly higher in snap count, but Henry had far more opportunities when you consider rushes plus targets. Henry was ahead 18-7 in total opportunities. However, in week 3, Henry's opportunity lead was only 11-8. Look, Spears is averaging 5.5 yards per carry, and I think he's the better pass catcher. And look, the Titans quite frankly, they looked terrible last week against the Browns. They could look towards their rookies in the second half of the season. Henry and Tannehill are both on the last years of their contract, and the Titans, I think, inevitably will have to shift towards the future once they're out of the playoff mix. As for the wide receiver position, I'm going to cheat on the first one and include Panthers wide receiver Adam Thielen, who's currently at 54% ownership, so just a little bit more than half ownership right now in ESPN leagues. But in week 3, he had 14 targets, 11 receptions, 145 yards receiving. He had 25 targets per route run. Look, Bryce Young, I think, is going to be out again in week 4. Andy Dalton will get another start, and he was clearly targeting Adam Thielen. Jonathan Mingo left with a concussion. If he's unavailable, Adam Thielen again will be a target hog. I don't know if I like Thielen going long-term into the season, but if you need somebody urgently here in week 4 or 5, Adam Thielen is available in half of ESPN leagues right now, and he's just coming off a 14-target, 11-reception game, and he's likely to see another here in week 4. And another player who's currently at 50% ownership is Browns wide receiver Elijah Brown. I'll just quickly mention that opportunities, which is rushes plus targets, in week 3, Jerome Ford had 13, Elijah Moore had 12, and Amari Cooper had 8. And look, for a team, the Browns, I think they actually have quite a bit of skill position depth, but their opportunity share is very concentrated on these 3 players. Now, both Cooper and Ford are widely owned right now in ESPN leagues, but Moore's the one who is currently at 50% ownership. But his usage in terms of opportunity counts is very much on par with Jerome Ford and Amari Cooper. Now, for a pair of younger players, I'll focus on second-year wide receiver Romeo Doubs of the Packers, currently at 27% ownership. Last week he had 5 receptions, 73 yards, and a touchdown in Week 3. But most importantly, he peaked in both targets and route participation. He was up to 11 targets and 86% of snaps in Week 3, and he's seen both those measures climb quite a bit each week as he's been getting healthier. Now, as long as Christian Watson remains out, I think Romeo Doubs is the Packers wide receiver 1, and he could be due for an even larger game considering the fact that he had less than a 50% catch rate in the first week or in Week 3. And another player like Devon Achane that I think has a lot of veritability to their game, to their fantasy production, but that is Texans rookie wide receiver Tank Dell. He's currently at 23% ownership. Now, he broke out last week with 5 receptions on 7 targets. He had 145 yards receiving and a touchdown. He had a breakaway 68-yard touchdown reception in the fourth quarter to seal the victory for the Texans. Now, target share between Tank Dell, Nico Collins, and Robert Woods has been pretty similar after 3 games, so this is not a player, again, I would be going high on from a FAAB dollar and auction standpoint. That is Tank Dell, but Tank Dell has also been below 2/3 snap share in 2 of his 3 games, including his Week 3 breakout. But the rookie is very explosive. He's averaging over 16 yards per reception through 3 games, and he's got 2 touchdowns, which has put him inside the top 20 at his position so far in fantasy scoring through 3 weeks. Again, Tank Dell at 23% ownership. And then the last player I'll recommend is right now less than 1% owned in ESPN leagues, and that is Chargers wide receiver Josh Palmer. Now, I'm recommending Josh Palmer and not Quentin Johnston as your waiver wire target to replace Mike Williams, who suffered a season-ending knee injury on Sunday. Now, Palmer has been the wide receiver 3 on the depth chart all summer, and that has not changed at any point. And Palmer has run significantly more routes through 3 games than Quentin Johnston. And after the Mike Williams injury, Josh Palmer became an every down player on Sunday. He played 11 out of a possible 13 snaps, including every passing play. And last year, Josh Palmer, he averaged 13 fantasy points a game when Mike Williams was out. And then lastly, at the tight end position, 2 guys that I've just kind of been banging the table for, even before the season, or continue to be 2 guys I would be targeting on the waiver wire. Jake Ferguson of the Cowboys, currently at 20% ownership. I think he continues to impress given his sample size. And most importantly, though, his routes run and his snap participation increased in Week 3. His number of routes run in Week 3 was 29 routes. He averaged 15 per game in Weeks 1 and 2. And his route participation broke 50%. He was at 52% in Week 3. He averaged 33% per game in the previous 2 weeks. So Jake Ferguson is second on the team in targets, and he has the highest target per route run rate for the Dallas Cowboys. And then the other player is Packers rookie tight end Luke Musgrave. He is currently at 13% ownership. And look, Musgrave just continues to play most offensive snaps. He's caught 6 of 8 targets for 49 yards in Week 3. And he would have had an even much bigger game in Week 3 had Jordan Love not sailed a touchdown pass where Musgrave got behind the defense. He would have had a much bigger game than his 6 catches for 49 yards had Jordan Love just hit him in stride. But look, just like Sam Laporta, who did have his breakout game in Week 3, Musgrave is playing over 80% of snaps. He's the second highest target getter on his team's offense. He just hasn't had that breakout game, which includes a touchdown yet, but I think it will come here in time. Again, Luke Musgrave only at 13% ownership ahead of the Week 4 waivers. So that'll do it for today's episode. Make sure to like and subscribe. You can also find us on Twitter at FFAlchemistPod. We'll be back midweek with another episode to look at our Week 3 observations and trends. And then by Friday, we'll have a podcast to look at players you should not be afraid to start as we get into Week 4 of the fantasy season. So for Dustin Chandry, signing off here at the Fantasy Alchemist Podcast. Thank you for listening to the Fantasy Alchemist Podcast. You can follow the pod on Twitter at FFAlchemistPod or email us at fantasyalchemistpodcast@gmail.com.